Hi, my name is David Day, and I am an intentional camera movement photographer located in Hendersonville, North Carolina. I started out my photography career in Fairfield, Connecticut in the 1990s, photographing lighthouses and other New England landmarks. Upon retiring and moving to Hendersonville, I began exploring alternative forms of photography, which ultimately led me to ICM and the creation of my own form of ICM images, which I call Studio ICM, using common items found around the house like leaves, twigs, tissue paper, newsprint, pieces of glass, and plastic bags. This presentation was created for the Durham, North Carolina Photography Club and covers the basics of traditional ICM photography, plus my studio work and how I create my abstract ICM images. So let's go ahead and get started. My first exposure to ICM was at a presentation titled Camera Tossing. Yes, there are photographers who make images by turning on their timers and then tossing their cameras up into the air. I've yet had the nerve to try this myself because I fear the first toss of my $2,000 camera would result in a missed catch. Comparing traditional ICM photographers to camera tossers, it's my opinion that camera tossers would benefit from professional mental health help. However, when it comes to ICM photography, I think photographers in this genre are beyond professional help, as this method of producing images is so addictive that on a typical day, a dedicated ICM photographer will make as many as 1,000 exposures with their cameras. However, unlike camera tossing, I'd like to point out that ICM is not just a happy accident. Even though they often occur, as you will see today, an exceptional ICM image is often the result of extensive planning and execution. Sometimes when people look at my images, I get compliments on my use of artificial intelligence in producing abstract art. However, in the images you see here today, no artificial intelligence was used to augment any of my images. Personally, I think there are only some very limited applications to AI in ICM photography, and I want my art to be reflective of my vision and not that of an automated internet search engine. So, consequently, I do not use AI in any of my images. Before we jump into the various forms of ICM photography, I'd like to share with you a few of my thoughts on sharing techniques and processes. Because my ICM photography is so different from what others are doing, I often get emails and texts from people telling me I should not be disclosing how my work is done. But I take a different view on this whole matter of generating proprietary art. My belief is that through sharing of techniques and processes, we all become better artists by building upon one another's methods of producing art. What got me to where I am today is a consequence of building upon other artists' methods, and if someone takes up my work and further improves on it, that will incentivize me to explore additional new methods and processes to keep the ICM movement vibrant and evolving. With that in mind, today I'm going to show you in great detail how I do what I do to produce my photographic art. The image here is a triptych I call Oscillations. It is simply a rotational ICM of a ring light laid on top of a plastic bag that has been backlit by LED lights. This is me at the recent Art in the Park show that is held 6 times a year in Asheville, North Carolina. I really like this show and have a great time interacting with the people who visit my pop-up gallery. If you find yourself visiting Western North Carolina, please drop me an email, and if I'm having a show while you're here, I really enjoy the opportunity to meet with you in person. My email is davidlday@yahoo.com. Here is a little bit of history on how ICM got started. In the 1990s, a gentleman named Michael Orton began experimenting with using camera movement to impart the sense of motion into his photography using a digital camera. He called this process of producing images the Orton effect. A few examples of ICM could be found when photography was still a film process. but they're quite rare because ICM is fairly unpredictable and the cost of getting a good image with a film camera is quite high. To give you a general idea of how expensive it would be to make ICM images with film compared to digitally produced images, here is a comparative cost breakdown. I do about 360,000 images a year, including the cost of film and processing. That would equate to an annual cash outlay of about $200,000 to produce roughly 250 images that go into my online gallery. With the advent of quality digital cameras, I can cut that cost by about 99.8% because my film cost is reduced to about $29 for a single 128 gigabyte SD card. Now let's start getting into ICM processes by first attempting to define what ICM is. ICM is simply an intentional camera movement during a longer than normal exposure in an attempt to create a sense of motion and mystery into a photograph. The subject matter for most ICM photographers is usually the same as that of photographers who try to keep their cameras perfectly still during an exposure. Things like portraits, landscape, architecture, and street scenes are common in ICM photography. However, I found that by combining camera movement with strategic creative lighting decisions that I could create abstract images that could be interpreted in many different ways. Here is a good example of how most people start their ICM journey. This image by Karen Thompson won an international contest for producing ICM images of trees. This image was produced at sunset with a long exposure of about 2 seconds at f/22 while panning upward. If you've never done ICM before, a stand of trees is a good place to start, as a vertical pan will stretch the trees out by various amounts depending on how fast or slow you pan the scene. And here you can compare Karen's nature scene to what I do. This is a triptych of backlit newsprint, plastic bags, and a crystal ball that was made using a 10mm lens with the camera settings of f/16, ISO 200 with a 1 1/2 second exposure. This image won the 2024 Carolinas Photography Competition, which was a real surprise to me as judges often dismiss ICM images because they think they are artificially produced. I used both camera shaking and a small amount of rotation to produce these 3 images. Note how the crystal ball in the center photograph simultaneously magnified and duplicated the newsprint behind the glass ball relative to the rest of the scene. There are 5 basic categories of ICM photography. Single exposure ICM photography is by far the most common form, where one exposure is made and then refined in post-processing software. Combining 2 or more exposures to make a final image takes on 2 forms, with the first being blending of exposures within the camera. The second form that I use is post-processing compositing, where one exposure is blended into a second exposure using the variety of blending methods available in Photoshop. I find this process most useful when blending together images that have distinct separate elements in terms of objects, lighting, hue, and saturation. Pep ventosa is another type of ICM where multiple still exposures of the subject taken at different positions relative to the subject are blended together to produce a soft ethereal effect. Finally, the method that I almost exclusively use today is studio ICM, where I am creating scenes of a variety of amorphous objects like tissue paper, newsprint, plastic bags, and the like, combined with a variety of backlighting and side lighting techniques to produce the images. With this information, let's take a look at a representative example of each of these techniques and the final images they produce. Here is a good example of a single exposure image that was made with a 1 1/2 second exposure panning upward. I was standing on top of a large tree stump looking down into this late afternoon woodland scene in a park just outside of my hometown. I gained a bit of additional definition in the foreground by momentarily holding the camera steady at the beginning of the exposure and then smoothly panning upward. Robert Betchell gives a good example of multiple in-camera exposure blending using the dark mode settings on his camera. By taking the first shot with a slight vertical movement, followed by alignment and a second shot with a slight horizontal movement, Robert successfully created the illusion of a lot of intricate branches in the trees and blade structure in the foreground meadow grasses. Here is an example of multiple exposure post-processing blending of studio-generated images with a single backlit plastic bag. Each image in this two-shot exposure was unremarkable. However, when blended together with soft light, they created an unusual image that could be interpreted in many different ways. As a footnote, my recommendation is not quickly discard single exposure images that look just okay. Sometimes when these throwaway images are blended together, they can create something remarkable. And finally, there is pure studio ICM photography. I had a lot of fun making this image, which consists of backlit plastic bags, an LED ring light, and bits of black construction paper. The mirror images on the left and right were made with a 2-second exposure while simultaneously shaking and moving the camera very slightly 3 times during the exposure. For the middle exposure, I started the image by holding the camera steady about 8 inches away from the subject and then quickly pulled the camera back to about 12 inches away from the subject using a 10mm lens. Here is what makes ICM photography so much fun for me. The term for the tendency to see something that is really not there in nature or abstract art is pareidolia. I am sure you have all seen a woman who appears on multiple talk shows from time to time on TV, displaying potato chips and grilled cheese sandwiches that have images of people like Elvis and the Mother Mary imprinted on them. That's pareidolia. Just spending a lazy day watching clouds in the sky that suggest animal shapes is another example of the pareidolia effect. My image shown here of a gull is also a good example of this effect. The image is a single bamboo leaf suspended in a dark box with a small side light. The camera rotation makes the leaf look like it has wings, and a fortunate imperfection in the lit area of the leaf suggests a beak and an eye. Now let's get into the details of making an ICM image. We will cover the rules, camera selection, lenses and filter options, camera settings, camera movement types, and my studio techniques. Following this discussion, I'll be giving you an assignment for ICM practice before we meet again next month. As for rules, there is only one rule in ICM photography, and that rule is don't get discouraged and quit. It takes a lot of time, effort, personal experimentation, and a lot of exposures to generate good ICM images. Here are 2 examples of my first ICM images. The one on the left is a steeple on a gazebo in my neighborhood in the late evening against a backdrop of a lake and a mountain. The second is looking up at the deck on my house on the same day with vertical movement. These were the only 2 good shots I got out of the 300 shots I took that day, and right away I learned that ICM is a trial and error process. But the errors are going to become less over time as you get into the groove of making ICM images. So don't get discouraged if your first shots turn out not so good. Mine did not turn out well at all. So I continued to make ICM images using primarily vertical panning with exposures of about 1 second at f/16 and an ISO of 100. At about 10,000 shots later, I began to produce images like this one on a routine basis. It is a simple one, 3 Japanese maple trees turning color in the fall. The green and yellow areas in the bottom third of the image are the grass and a couple of bushes in my neighbor's yard, and the blue-gray areas are from where a road was peeking through the trees. With traditional still photography, this scene would have looked busy, but for ICM nature photography, the blend of colors was just right. One day when I was coming home from a shoot, I had a happy accident that changed my mind completely in regard to ICM photography. As I walked through my workshop on my way to another room to process my images, I noticed a jumble of plastic-coated copper wire on my workbench. On my way past the workbench, I took one single photo of that wire with a rotational movement that was way closer than where the camera was sharply focused. This is what came out when I processed that image, and it set off the last 3 years of my experimentation with lighting in a dark box, photographing a variety of materials. By the time I had about 50,000 shots on my camera, I was exploring side lighting things like twigs, leaves, and tree bark. Large leaf plants like this collard green leaf worked exceptionally well for ICM photography when side lit with a 5-watt lamp. By bending parts of the leaves toward and away from the light, I found I could generate a number of effects because of the semi-transparent nature of many leaves. Collard greens is a simple 1/4 rotation of the camera against the folded side-lit leaf over a 1-second exposure. If you're lucky enough to have a smooth rotation of the camera during the exposure, you will be rewarded with both the ICM effect and a very well-focused area where the center of the rotation is occurring. I eventually branched out into a variety of materials for subject matter. This image is an orange wire to which 2 small pieces of red tissue paper were attached. This image was entered into a still life competition, and to my surprise it won. The image created a lot of controversy with several others who had entered the competition because the image had so much motion in it. But one of the judges pointed out that the rules stated a stationary, artist-created scene was required, but nothing mentioned not moving the camera. I literally won that competition for thinking outside the box. The experimentation almost took over my whole house. At one point I was draping plastic bags over dining room chairs and positioning them against natural light coming through a window and arranging my tissue paper scenes on the chair seat with added side lighting. If you look closely at this 1-second rotational ICM, you can see traces of the rungs of the chair back coming through the blue plastic bag. Bouncing a ball is one of my favorite ICM images. In addition to backlighting tissue paper and partially folded plastic bags, I added side lighting to this exposure. The scene also included a glass jar and a crystal ball. The movement was a 1-second exposure with 3 quick movements to the left. The side lighting caught some of the wooden frame of my original dark box, and somehow the glass jar thread perfectly aligned with it to look like an arm with bracelets on it. A very small amount of the side lighting caught the crystal ball and created a vague moving outline of a ball being bounced. I love this image. Tempest is another image that I include here to encourage you to think about how you might modify your lens to generate something unique. In this image, I held a fluted water glass over the lens and shot through it as I moved the camera slowly from left to right during a 1-second exposure. The subject matter is a backlit plastic bag and blue LED lights. As I progressed through my experiments, I've maintained notes to remind me of what happened and why. Here are some of the things that I have discovered. First and foremost, time and multiple shots are key to success. On a typical day, I take 500 to 1,000 shots in the morning. As they upload to the cloud, I go about my daily non-photography business. In the evening, I call and post-process my images. Lighting relative to subject placement is critical. Small changes in light positioning, intensity, and color can reveal or conceal important elements in an image. Each scene presents unique challenges, so expect to experiment with things like camera movement patterns, speed of movements, exposure time, and angle of camera to the scene as you move it. On any typical day, I estimate that it takes me 200 to 300 shots with a new scene with constant experimentation before I start getting the results I want. When something does start working, take a lot of shots with only very slight incremental technical changes, and don't rely solely on the camera viewfinder for making decisions. A lot of shots I thought looked great in the camera had unrecoverable flaws when viewed on a full computer screen. Finally, happy accidents are going to occur. Embrace them as part of the ICM journey. Here are some additional things to consider. Focus and simplicity of the scene will often make for better ICM images, simply because simplicity minimizes distracting element collisions, like dark trees against bright skies. If you're going for the best possible focus, try to keep the camera rotation in a single plane, but do the opposite if you want to put the viewer's attention on a specific part of a scene. Also, you can avoid a lot of frustration in making ICMs by sometimes just putting the camera down and walking away from it for a while. As my frustration level goes up, I rarely produce anything good. Also, try shooting to something rhythmic like music. I find that music helps me to find my ICM groove and produces better images, although I'd not want for anyone to see me dancing while shooting to music. Last but not least, it's important to let scene elements determine your camera movements. Vertical elements look best with vertical panning, horizontal elements with horizontal panning, and circular elements with rotation, and on and on. Also, we need to talk a minute about individual tendency to subconsciously repeat ICM movements in the same way over and over again. Like a golfer practicing his swing, we tend to fall into patterns as ICM artists. To avoid this and the stagnation in image output that comes along with it, consciously try to experiment with changing up your ICM movements by doing movements such as starting, stopping, and restarting at different rates of speed, mixing up smooth single motions with multiple speeds of motion during an exposure, shaking the camera at different frequencies and amplitudes of shaking, multiple movements away and closer to the subject, and various forms of camera rotation. Then think about ways to mix all of this up to create unique movement patterns between the start and end of an exposure to generate unique ICM images. Here is a good example of focus and scene simplicity. This scene is nothing more than a daffodil stem, a blue tissue, and a piece of tree bark suspended in my light box. The next slide will show you the result of a vertical movement with rotation onto this side-lit scene. And here is an even simpler scene consisting of a piece of green masking tape and a banana peel with the same side lighting. Let's talk now about equipment. Since ICM is a manual, long exposure process, any digital camera with a manual setting and the ability to expose a scene for longer than 1 second will work well. I prefer a mirrorless camera over a DSLR simply because I make a lot of exposures, and theoretically a camera with fewer moving parts should have greater longevity as a consequence. I shot over 1 million exposures with my Fuji X-T4 mirrorless camera, and it is still working without any breakdown issues. Shutter priority can also work for ICM image creation, but in this mode you lose control over aperture settings, and ICM works better when aperture as well as shutter speed can both be controlled independent of one another. Also, because in many cases you will want to keep aperture and shutter settings constant, the ability to quickly adjust ISO settings is a plus when dealing with variable lighting situations. An important feature often overlooked by many ICM artists is camera size. It's important for comfort that the camera fit your hand. I'd much prefer to rotating a small frame Fuji camera over and over again to wrestling a big full frame Nikon or Canon camera. As far as lenses are concerned, the most expensive lens in my kit is the Laowa 10mm cookie lens at a cost of $249. My other two lenses are the Rokinon 12mm and a TT Artisan's 23mm lens. These inexpensive manual lenses are well suited to studio ICM, as I'm not concerned with things like edge-to-edge sharpness, vignetting, and chromatic aberration, because the lens is painting across the scene with no part of the lens ever being dedicated to a single part of the final image. Also, shorter focal lengths and shorter lens barrels are a plus in ICM photography, as it is easier to control movement of a lens in a short tube than a lens in a long tube. One of the odd things I've found out about lenses is that sometimes I get better results with one over the other. I don't know if there's any scientific reason for this and think it may be simply due to day-to-day variation in the way I move the camera relative to any given scene that I'm trying to make a photograph of. Something that is often overlooked by the ICM artist is the variable neutral density filter. As an ICM artist, you will be making longer than normal exposures, and brightly lit days often result in highlight blowouts, even at ISO 100 settings and lenses stopped up as high as they will go. This is where the variable ND filter saves the day, as you can quickly darken an image that has too many highlight areas that will end up in highlight blowouts. As for dark areas, it is always easier in post-processing to correct an underexposed area than it is to correct a highlight blowout. In my experience, the 9-stop filter is a better value than the 4-stop filter, as it gives more flexibility in darkening very bright scenes. Now we turn to initial camera settings I use for ICM photography. Please don't consider these as a rule, as they are just good starting points for how I work. First, I set my camera to manual mode with the camera mode dial. After that, everything that causes the camera to move the lens or stabilize an image is turned off. Sometimes these switches will be manual ones on the front of the camera body and on the lens barrel. Other times, specifically on cameras with internal stabilization capability, they will be found somewhere on your camera's electronic menu settings. I usually start out at ISO settings that are the lowest ones available on my camera and an f-stop greater than f8 to give some depth of field to compensate for an uneven plane of camera movement. I started out with camera exposure times of 1 second, but recently more of my work has been done in a 2-second time frame. Finally, I'll attach and adjust the variable neutral density filter to a setting that eliminates as much highlight blowout as possible. Before I forget, I want to talk briefly about the use of smartphones for ICM image making, as this question comes up quite often. With Android cameras, there is a third-party app called the Camera FV5 that has what they call a synthetic exposure setting that allows multiple rapid shots to occur over a long exposure interval. Although not intended for ICM photography, this app can produce some very nice ICM images, as you can see from this photograph at the side of my property. On Apple iPhones, their cameras are now equipped with an extended exposure setting, so Apple iPhones can work quite well as ICM cameras right out of the box. After you take a few evaluation shots, there are several things you can do to improve your ICM images. First, don't hesitate to experiment with different exposure times and speeds of camera movement. both variables can dramatically change the look and feel of the final image. Use your neutral density filter and ISO settings to minimize under and overexposure areas of your image captures. If nothing seems to be in focus, consider using a higher f-stop and pay attention to keeping the camera motion in a single plane of movement to improve overall focus. And finally, try changing lenses to help achieve the effect you are looking for. It seems that sometimes a few millimeter difference in focal length can make or break an ICM image. Now let's take a look at some of the more popular camera movement methods. Here is a good 180-degree rotation of a palm tree courtesy of Scott Bechtel. We talked earlier about matching camera movement up to the direction of elements in a scene. Fred Monk achieved a very good and moody rural scene by slowly panning vertically in this image. And then we have a freeform example of my work. This is the center panel of my work, Perils of the Road Less Traveled, that we talked about early in this presentation. I used a variety of shaking and rotational movements to produce this image. Tendinitis is another example of free-form ICM photography. This backlit scene of tissue paper, plastic bags, and the base of a glass vase was produced with a rapid left-to-right movement, a rapid 180-degree rotation, followed by an immediate downward repositioning of the camera to generate the scene. This was all done with a 1-second exposure. Multi-exposure post-processing composites are always a lot of fun to produce. This type of image blending doesn't always work well, but sometimes it can give intriguing results with what would otherwise be throwaway images. Can you see a red egret flying out of an enclosed green space on this image? And then there is the zoom and reverse zoom technique. On my fixed lenses, I achieve this result by rapidly moving the camera either forward or away from the scene with intermittent short stops along the way. To make enough exposure time to achieve the intermittent stops, I use a 2-second or longer exposure to generate the concentric rings seen in this image titled Black Body Radiation. Shaking the camera either with fine rapid movements or slow deliberate movements can produce some interesting results. The black swamp grass in this image titled Hidden in Barbie Land is the result of very fine and rapid camera shaking. And finally, there is wide area camera movement. Following a backlit plastic diffusion ring on its outer perimeter produced this image. The trick here is a steady camera movement that covers a wide circular area that follows the plastic diffuser. The use of torn newsprint added additional fine details to the final image, which took a 2-second exposure to produce. To give you some ideas for an assignment that will follow, I have included some additional ICM images for you to use as a reference to begin your ICM experimentation. Trees are always a great place to start, as demonstrated by this low-key image by Barbara Orchard. We've already seen this image by Karen Thompson at the beginning of this presentation, but I have included it again here because I like it so much. Large bodies of water are always great ICM opportunities. By following a wave coming into the shore at low tide with a 2-second exposure at sunset, this image was produced. Here is a shot by one of my favorite artists from New Zealand. Rena Sargent Thompson made this exquisite image by following the S-curves in a river leading to the ocean. This is an image I recently took of a stand of dead trees in an estuary of Cape Fear, North Carolina. Don't forget that black and white images can often impart power to the final production. This was a 1-second exposure with the ND filter set to 7 stops. Street scenes and buildings can also be popular subjects for ICM. In this case, it looks like Cheryl Unger used a pinhole lens along with slight movement to create an eerie scene of an abandoned building. Tom Krebsbach took this concept one step further with a multi-shot in-camera blend using a horizontal image on top of a vertical shot to create this dramatic scene of a building. People and animals are always great subjects for ICM photography. I really like this image by Anna Court as the shaking and panning combination gives a real sense of motion and tension between the two people who are interacting. This image by Barbara Orchard is a fun one. She positioned the person's neck right in line with the distant shoreline of the body of water to make the person look like they are walking along with a detached head. In this image, Esmeralda Dippin took an ICM image of a barn bird to make it look unusually active and disturbed. Although not an image of an actual person, this ICM of a Mardi Gras mask is just weird and creepy. It was a 1-second rotational exposure with a bit of post-processing. This image is one of my best sellers, and I've sold a number of them to people who are into the goth lifestyle. Flowers and plants are fun images for anyone doing ICM. I took a single weed out of my garden and suspended it in my dark box with side lighting. A 1/4 twist rotation at 1 second of exposure produced this image that I call Fred and Ginger. If you like the experimental aspects of ICM, then photographing plastic-coated wire may be just for you. This piece of blue wire was kinked up, and with side lighting and a 1 second rotational exposure, this is the image that I achieved. The light white striations are created from the detailed interplay of light and shadows produced by the side lighting. It sells well with people who enjoy the vector aspects of ICM art. Photographing tissue paper using ICM techniques can produce some interesting results because tissue paper is opaque and can be positioned many different ways relative to the light source for a variety of effects. In this side-lit image, I attached a few pieces of orange and white tissue paper to a plastic-coated copper wire. With a combination of slight rotation and movement from left to right, I produced this image. Don't forget shooting straight at lights to generate fireworks-like ICM images. Fred Monk provides a good example of this rotational image of a variety of lights. And finally, just have some fun with the whole ICM process. This image is a backlit plastic bag and piece of white parchment paper. What I did here was create a copy of the image, and after horizontally reversing the original image and blending the copy on top of it, I produced something that to me looks like a Mars lander. And of course, the Mars lander needed some perilous place to land, so I took another image from the image series and layered the lander on top of it to make it look like the space vehicle was about to touch down on the Martian surface. You may be wondering what my studio looks like. Well, here it is. The studio is a large black Home Depot storage box. On the right inside of the box are all of the controls for my variety of lights used in the studio. The power strip for the lights and all the needed supplies are contained inside the box, so I can tote it to different locations for demonstrations on how I make my art. In the process of creating a scene, I will layer tissue paper, newsprint, plastic bags, pieces of glass, LED ring lights, and whatever else comes to mind on top of the lighting and take several shots of the scene and moving things around with different camera motions until I get the effect that I'm looking for. I have experimented with a lot of different lights over the past several years, and here are the ones I use most frequently. The Govee Glide Hexa lights are the light base I use in about all of my studio ICM images. Each of the 10 interlocking hexagonal lights are individually controlled in color and brightness with an app on my cell phone. On the middle image is a light box. I cut the LED light out of the light box and used that ring in many of my studio images. Filters for the LED light ring were hand-fashioned from the many colored diffusion panels that came with the light box. Finally, for accent lighting, I used 4 1-foot strips of LED lights from a company called Hit Lights. They come with a controller that manages the light, color, and intensity of the LED strips. I position these strips wherever needed to create the lighting effect I want in my studio scenes. Not shown here is a 5-watt LED lamp with a homemade snooker attachment to focus side lighting on a scene where needed. This slide lists some resources on the internet to help you learn more about ICM photography. Joining one or several Facebook groups dedicated to ICM photography is a great place to learn about this unique art form. One of the best and most active groups for this exploration is ICM Photomag. The largest group on Facebook in terms of members is the ICM International Camera Movement Photography Group with over 40,000 worldwide members. If you are interested in joining my group, sign up for ICM Artists. As for instructional resources, B&H Photo has a good tutorial on ICM, as does Petapixel and Digital Photography School. I have also produced a number of instructional videos, primarily on my studio work, that can be found on YouTube. If you are looking for an immersive ICM experience in ICM photography, the place to go for information is stephjohnphoto.com. Stephanie Johnson is a great teacher of ICM techniques, and she routinely does week-long workshops at various places in the United States. Also, Camversation is a Zoom-based group that holds online workshops every month, and you can find them online at camversation.com. Many of their workshops are ICM oriented. So now it's time for your assignment. Between now and our follow-up meeting next month, I'd like you to experiment with making ICM photographs of subjects or scenes of your choice. Post-process these photographs in whatever post-processing software you normally use. Please note that ICM photographs usually benefit from exposure and contrast enhancement, texture, clarity, and dehazing adjustment, denoising, which is always done before sharpening, and a little hue and saturation adjustments. After you have your images, bring your best one or two to our next meeting to show off your new skills and engage in discussion of how you made your image and ideas for improvement. In closing, I'd like to sincerely thank you for taking the time to attend this workshop. I hope you enjoy ICM image making as much as I do. If you'd like to see more of my work and have questions, go to my website, ddayicmart.com. You can get there also by scanning the QR code on this slide. Also, you can follow my work on both Instagram and Facebook, as well as access my tutorials on YouTube. Again, thanks for your time. I hope you enjoyed the presentation.